Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. I have this reading recap just for the past few months that I'm going to share with you, and I'll make sure I link my previous one up above in case you want to check my thoughts out on any other books. But I think that's all I need to say to get started. The only other thing I wanted to mention is the fact that I read everything on my Kindle. This is the, I think, 2018 standard Kindle. So nothing fancy, but it gets the job done, and I love this because I bring it with me everywhere and it allows me to read a lot. So with that, I'm going to get into my book reviews. I think I read about 17 books since my last update, and I'm just going to share all of my thoughts now. The first book I read since my last recap was Don't Look Back by Jo Spain, and it's a book about a married couple on holiday, and on the holiday the wife reveals that a dangerous man from her past came to find her, so she killed him, and the whole book is about how the couple deal with this and what they do about it. I gave this book 4 stars. I did really like it. I had high hopes for it as well, since I had enjoyed a Jo Spain book that I read before, which I think is called The Perfect Lie. I did really like that one, and this one I think would have been 5 stars here if it weren't for the ending. I still enjoyed it overall, it just lost me a tiny bit with the ending, but I liked all of the plot twists and reveals that it had. The next book I read was Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. This is the story about a married couple that go away on an anniversary weekend to a wintry lodge in Scotland, I think. And basically it's about someone who doesn't want them to live happily ever after. I gave this book 5 stars. I read it really quickly. It was my first Alice Feeney, and I think I read it in less than 24 hours. It wasn't one sitting, it was like 2 sittings, but that's still a pretty quick read for me. I was intrigued by the plot, but I had also heard a lot of people say that it ends every chapter on a cliffhanger, which it does, and I think that really makes you want to keep reading and figure out what's going on. Also, it's going to become apparent pretty soon that quite a lot of the books I read over the past couple months were quite wintry, since it's been the winter season in Australia. So I just thought I'd mention that, and you'll get the idea as I explain more books that I read. The next book that I read was Behind Closed Doors by B.A. Paris. This is a book about another married couple, and they are seemingly the perfect couple from the outside looking in, but it reveals what's going on behind closed doors, because things aren't always as they seem, and sometimes they can be quite dark behind the scenes. Now, this is actually the first book that I've given 1 star to ever, but I did finish it. I'm not going to talk about it too long since I don't want to be negative, but I really didn't enjoy this one. It was a tough slog to get through. I would say for this, if you still want to check it out despite me saying 1 star, I'll explain a bit on why, but I would say before reading it, definitely check trigger warnings. I knew what it was all about. Somehow I heard through the grapevine prior to reading, so nothing came as a surprise to me, but I just overall felt that the plot was very boring and somehow still over the top at times due to the villain or antagonist of the story. I didn't like this one, and I guess the only positive I can say is it was on Prime Reading, so it didn't cost me any money to read, but I didn't enjoy this one and I couldn't really recommend it. Although some people might find it enjoyable, I just wasn't one of those people. Now, the list actually gets a little bit worse before it gets better. The next book I'm talking about is Then She Was Gone by Lisa Jewell. This is a book told in dual timelines. It is about a teenage girl who goes missing, and 10 years later, after the teenage girl disappears, her mother, about 10 years on, meets a man who she falls in love with, and that man has a daughter who looks just like her missing daughter. But it's not the same person, because this daughter is the same age as the daughter who disappeared. So it's a little bit of a mystery there. Now, why I said things get a bit worse is because I couldn't actually finish this book, so another first for me. This is my first DNF. Now, I actually really wanted to read this one because the premise seemed so interesting, but as I started it, I think pretty early on, I was innocently Googling something and had it spoiled for me. Basically, the whole twist and whole plot of the book was given away quite early on for me through looking up something online. So it is kind of my fault here, but I will say, even though I didn't finish it, I did read a summary, and I'm kind of glad I didn't finish it because I don't think I would have liked it. It seemed a little bit too out there for me. So I'll be completely honest, at this point, when I was reading a couple months ago and had a 1 star and then a DNF, I was in no mood. I didn't want to continue this kind of losing streak, so I reached for a book that I thought would be pretty good and lift my spirits again, or wrong phrasing. I picked up a book that I thought I would really like, and that was The Good Daughter by Karen Slaughter. This is another book that's told in dual timeline, and it's about a family that experiences a huge traumatic event one night, and then in present day, two daughters from that family are brought back together again after another very different tragedy. This book I gave 4.5 stars. I thought it was really enjoyable, even though it was very, very, very dark. So I can't say I loved it too much or that it picked up my spirits, because it was actually quite depressing for a lot of it to read. With that being said, I enjoyed it a lot. Obviously I gave it 4.5 stars. Now, I did reach for this one since I really enjoyed Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. Again, that was also a very bleak book. Believe it or not, I would say this one seemed even more depressing through certain points. So again, I would say for this book, definitely look up trigger warnings, because there is a lot going on and it is very dark and bleak. This book was very similar to Pretty Girls in my opinion, in a good way I'd say. The plot was not the same, but there were very similar themes, including the fact they were both very dark stories about grief and trauma, and about two sisters who reconnect after a troubled past. And I think both books felt very cinematic to me, or maybe I'm not wording that right. Both books definitely felt like thriller movies, but on the page. So that was kind of interesting. To finish up, the only reason why I didn't give this book 5 stars, because it was really good and I've said a lot of good things about it here, and I enjoyed it, I'd recommend it, but as I was about to say, the only reason why I didn't give it 5 stars is because certain chapters and paragraphs were very repetitive. When I was talking about the moment in the past that sort of set everything off, certain scenes were repeated, and it was changed slightly each time, but it was still incredibly repetitive. So that's the smallest little negative I can think of there, but still overall really good, despite how dark it was. After I finished The Good Daughter, I did need something a little bit more light and airy-fairy, so I reached for Colleen Hoover. I read It Starts With Us. Now, this is obviously a continuation of It Ends With Us. I feel like a lot of people know what that's about already, or if you don't, I probably wouldn't summarize it here anyway, because it kind of gives certain things away there. But I gave this book 2.5 stars. I started by saying I enjoyed It Ends With Us for what it was, which to me, it's not a romantic book. It is obviously just a kind of drama. I think a lot of people class it as romance. I didn't really see that at all for what it was. And for what it was, like I said, I enjoyed it. This one just definitely seemed like more of a continuation, like an extended epilogue, and I didn't love or hate this book. I also didn't feel like it was particularly necessary. So it was fine for a light sort of airy-fairy read, like I said, after reading something so grim, which I had just previously done. I'm also not someone who typically reads romantic sort of drama books. That's not something I gravitate towards, so I'm sure if you do, you'd probably have very different feelings on it. But this one served its purpose for me, and it was a fine read. Definitely not something I would reach for again, and I think people would only really like it if they were big fans of It Ends With Us. It was entertaining, and sometimes I think a book that is just entertaining is fine, in my opinion. After I finished that one, I felt ready to reach for another thriller again, so I read All the Dangerous Things by Stacey Willingham. This is a book about a mother who is trying to cope 1 year on after her toddler son disappeared in the middle of the night. She can't sleep in present day, and she's grieving and trying to figure out what happened to him. I gave this book 3.5 stars, and I'll start out by saying I was actually immediately drawn to this one because of the cover and the title. It just seemed really intriguing to me, and the plot sounded interesting enough. Again, kind of like some of the other books I mentioned, like Karen Slaughter, this kind of feels like a thriller movie. Something about it. I think some books definitely feel like that more than others, and this one felt like I was reading a movie, if that makes sense. I liked the twists that this one had, even though there was one twist that I did pick, which isn't always a bad thing. I just sort of figured out something halfway through the book, and overall I enjoyed it enough. It made me interested in checking out some more Stacey Willingham books as well. The next book I read was actually a new release at the time. I think I read it shortly after it came out, and that was Happy Place by Emily Henry. This is of course about a group of couples who go away every year on an annual trip, and the main couple that we're following here have actually broken up, but they pretend to be together for the sake of their friends. I really loved this one and I gave it 5 stars. I know in my previous recap I spoke about 2 other Emily Henry books, which were Book Lovers and Beach Read, which I read at the start of the year. And while I'm definitely not a romance reader typically, I knew I had to read this. Again, I was drawn in by the cover, I'd heard good things, and I thought that based on previous Emily Henry books, I like her writing style enough just for something fluffy and happy to read. This book was even better than what I expected, and I liked it more than Beach Read and Book Lovers, which I still enjoyed, but obviously this one's 5 stars. I liked it overall for its sweet message. It was heartwarming and sad in parts. It was funny. I don't think I've ever highlighted a book so much in my life, but I was highlighting heaps in this, or, you know, capturing it on my Kindle. I also think one of the main reasons why I liked this so much is because of the friendships, and that was really sweet to me. More so than the relationships, I'd say. The friendships were really sweet and all of the characters felt like real people. It's just very well rounded. I'm sure a lot of people have read this already by the time I'm talking about it, if you're watching this, but if by chance you haven't, even me, someone who doesn't really like romance very much, it's just so good and definitely something I'd read again. Following off that one, I reverted back to thrillers because for a while it really seemed like I was alternating. I decided to read another Stacey Willingham. This one is A Flicker in the Dark, which I think might have been her debut novel, but I read this one second of all. This book tells the story of a young woman who, in her history when she was a child or teenager, her father was revealed to have been a serial killer of teenage girls. And now as an adult, she's a psychologist and murders start happening again that are kind of similar. This book I gave 4 stars. I knew I had to pick it up after I enjoyed All the Dangerous Things, and I figured I may as well do it soon. Again, this book, I really liked the cover and the title. Something about it just really grabbed me, and obviously I had enjoyed the previous Stacey Willingham enough to check this out. I enjoyed this one ever so slightly more than All the Dangerous Things, hence the 4 stars, and I liked the twists in this one as well. Again, it had kind of a movie feel to it. I think as well that I will check out any future books that she writes because I liked these 2 so far. My next read was The Summer Holiday by S.E. Lines, and this is again about another couple on holiday in a tropical location, and the wife of the couple runs into someone that she knew back in school who she was kind of obsessed and wanted to be friends with at the time, and she tries to strike up a friendship now, but there are some strange things about her past and her husband's past as well that she has to figure out. I gave this book 4.5 stars, and it was another book that I got through NetGalley, so I was really impressed with this. Clearly I love thrillers, and it should be obvious as well that I love thrillers set on holidays. I just think that's really fun, and something I liked about this book too, which isn't a spoiler, it doesn't give anything away, but I thought it was really interesting that the main characters were all a little bit older, like they were in their 50s, I want to say. And I think that was a nice perspective to share versus characters that are teenage and I guess younger. It was really interesting to have that middle-aged perspective. This book had multiple point of views between all the main characters, and I think it was really easy to differentiate between them. Last of all, I thought it was pretty funny because when it was talking through the main character, I think her name was Kate, when it was talking through her mind, just her internal monologue, she was very funny and self-deprecating, and that was something that I noticed when I was reading, that it was funny as well as just being a little bit mysterious. At this point in my reading, I decided it was time to revisit another author, so I picked up Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. This is the second Alice Feeney book that I've read, and it's about a family reunion that is happening because the matriarch, 80-year-old Nana, is having her birthday party, so all family members meet at the Nana's house on this secluded island, or water rises up and it makes her house basically on an island, and people start dying off one by one over the course of one night. I gave this book 3 stars. I think there were definitely pros and cons. I knew it was similar to And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie going in, which I really enjoyed. Obviously it's a classic, but one thing, and I think partly why it's 3 stars for me, is I figured out what would happen very early on. I think it was in the first chapter I knew what would happen, and I'm not talking about people dying off, but a somewhat big twist in the story I could tell straight off the bat. I'm not sure if other people would as well. I'm not trying to talk myself up too much, but I don't know how obvious it is. It was very obvious to me With that being said, it was still an enjoyable story for what it was, and I would recommend it. I'm still keen to check out other Alice Feeney books. The next book I read was again off NetGalley because I tried to alternate a little bit reading off there as well. And this is a bit of a different style book for me since it's kind of self-help. I've read a few in the past, but not many this year, or this might have been the first one. And it is You're Going to Be Okay, 16 Lessons on Healing After Trauma by Madeline Popeka. I gave this book 4 stars, and it feels very weird to rate anything that is self-help or like a memoir in my opinion, especially something like this. And I don't even like really sharing my thoughts on it too much. I'm going to keep that quite brief and not talk about my experience too much here. But I did find the book quite helpful. It was very quick and easy to read. I think it was quite short. Like I said, I found it helpful. I think the only reason why I would say that it's 4 stars instead of like 5 stars, and 4 stars is still pretty good. I enjoyed it. I would recommend. But the reason why I think I'd say 4 stars is because some of the advice got ever so slightly repetitive. Again, it was short, and I'm a hypocrite because obviously I'm repetitive, probably talking in my reviews, but overall I enjoyed it and I appreciate getting it as a free copy on NetGalley. Following that one, I went back to a thriller and read The House in the Pines by Reyes. This book is about a young woman who, when she was a teenager, her best friend died in front of her under very mysterious circumstances. And now as an adult, she sees a YouTube video of all things where someone dies in a very similar way. So she tries to figure out what happened and awaken certain memories that are a little bit lost and figure out what happened to her friend. I give this book 3.5 stars, and again, it's a book I really love the cover of. I just think it looks super cool. Now, I actually had heard a few things about this from my sister and one of my friends who have both read it, and they said certain things to me that set me up a certain expectation that it has a bit of a strange ending or there's a weird element to the book. Without knowing much more than that, that's all I knew. I don't think it's a spoiler. Same could be said for a lot of books, to be honest, but hearing them say this, I had that intrigue there, and I did not really know what to expect. I was intrigued enough by the premise and the cover, like I said, but this weird thing they were talking about, I didn't find that weird. If you've read it, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. The only negative thing I could say is that I just kept expecting more, or I kept expecting like a twist ending or something, and it never actually came, so it felt a little bit lackluster in the ending, but for what it was, I enjoyed it. I think maybe I just needed to have different expectations or not overthink it as I was reading it, but it was enjoyable enough, and it was very different compared to other books that I've read, if that makes sense. Alright, we're getting down to the last handful of reviews here, the next of which I'm very excited to talk about, but I'll try to be brief. I'm talking about The Only One Left by Sega. Of course, I have a whole separate video just talking about this as I read it, so I'll make sure I link that up above as well. In case you didn't watch that one yet or haven't heard much about the book, it is about a young woman who is a stay-at-home care worker or an at-home care worker. She goes to clients' homes, and her current client is an elderly woman who, in that elderly woman's youth, was accused of murdering her entire family. Now she lives in this big gothic mansion, and our main character has to take care of her and tries to figure out what happened. I gave this book 5 stars, so I feel like there's a few 5 stars I've had this year, but this is probably the book that I was most excited for since I love Sega's books. Again, this is one where it's just got such a beautiful cover and title. When I'm saying title, sometimes I mean the title itself and sometimes I mean how the title looks, but I feel like it's the graphic design and the font. It just looks super duper cool, so I love that. But I've read all of Sega's work and I love his stories. I think that he's a really good author. Plus, it reminded me of the first Sega book that I read, which was Lock Every Door. There were certain similar themes to that one, and also Home Before Dark. If you've read those, like, you might like this one. I just think overall it was probably the best book that I've read this year so far, and like I said, my favorite Sega. So I would think check it out if you haven't yet. And like I said, I have a full review and all of my thoughts in a separate video, which again, linked up and down below. The next book I read, I was really excited for, and I'm glad that I had something to look forward to after such a good one. It's another book that was kind of a current release at the time and by an author that I enjoy. It is The Only One Left by Shari Pena. It's actually called Everyone Here is Lying. Again, I've read all of her books, so I was keen for this one. The plot is about a family that deals with the disappearance of their 9-year-old daughter, the ramifications of her going missing and trying to solve that mystery. I gave this book 4 stars, and I've got to say I had no idea on what to expect on this one based on the summary that I kind of read there, but the blurb on the back, obviously you know what happens, but I didn't know what more to expect or how it would pan out over the course of a full-on book. And the twist or reveal in the book that happens about halfway, I was completely shocked by. Didn't expect it, but I really enjoyed it. I think I've got to say one of my favourite genres or sub-genres of thrillers that I really love is the domestic and suburban thriller. They're just good comfort reads to me, and this was definitely one of those. After that one, I felt in the mood again for another wintry type thriller, so I picked up Secluded Cabin Sleep 6 by Lisa Unger. And this is a book about 3 couples who go away for the weekend to a secluded cabin. And while they're there, there is an approaching storm, secrets between them, and a stranger who wants to get some revenge. Now for this one, I did regrettably give it 2 stars. Sadly, I didn't enjoy this book as much as I hoped I would. It just fell flat to me, and it had 2 interwoven storylines. That's not a spoiler, it's just a factor of the book. 2 interwoven storylines which eventually met, and it just seemed very random and far-fetched to me. Some people may like this. I know that certainly in the past I've liked very out there books. Again, I'm a fan of Sega, but I just didn't like this one. It was random, far-fetched, and ultimately forgettable. And I've got to be honest as well, one thing that frustrated me is the fact that it's called Secluded Cabin Sleep 6, but it wasn't a secluded cabin. It was like a mansion in the woods, which is a very different energy. So I think maybe if it was titled something better, maybe I would have liked it more. I'm not really sure, but I think the expectations versus what I got was very different. Now after that one, I was hoping for a good read, so I decided to revisit an author who I had luck with in the past. So I read The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. This book is actually kind of similar in tone or theme to the previous, but I still wanted to give it a go because, like I said, or I had luck with Lucy Foley in the past, I enjoyed The Guest List. This book is about a group of friends who go away for New Year's. They're on a friends trip away. It's a wintry setting where they're staying. I think they're in Scotland. And one of the friends dies by New Year's Day. And one of the friends in the group had killed them. So over the course of the book, you're just trying to piece together who is dead and who is the killer. Now I gave this book 3 stars, and without sitting here and just doing a direct compare and contrast between the previous book and this book that I'm discussing now, I think it did that sort of theme a lot better, and I enjoyed it. Even though I'm giving it 3 stars, it was still a solid 3 stars. Like I have said, I enjoyed The Guest List by Lucy Foley. Obviously, again, it is a big cast of characters. In this book, I found them to be a lot more unlikable than in The Guest List, but it was intriguing just to have all the different point of view and kind of secrets and stories between a good core group of friends and unravel the mystery of who had died and who had killed them. Negatives for this one, I've got to say, I think I would have rated it higher if it had a different ending. Just the way it ended, I wasn't a fan of, and I've got to say for the first time ever that I really didn't like this cover. Just the colour and the deer head, I'm not a fan. The next book I read was I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. So again, I changed gears a little bit here and decided to pick up a celebrity memoir. This is about Jeanette McCurdy, who was a former child star on Nickelodeon. It tells her story of her difficult relationship with her mother, why she's glad that her mother died, obviously that's a very attention-grabbing title, and kind of just growing up in the industry. And this is actually another book that I've given 5 stars. Kind of similar to talking about the self-help book before, it does feel very weird to rate a book that is the story of someone's life. I want to say as well that I actually never watched her shows on Nickelodeon, so I didn't have that sort of history of seeing her there. I think I was a little bit too old to watch those shows at the time, but I had heard so many things about this book, and again, this is a cover that I do like, even though it's obviously a little bit strange. I think she's leaning into it, and it just seems kind of silly, the cover with the title. Obviously it's coming from a very serious place and very dark moments, but all of this to say, I really, really enjoyed this book. I think I could feel more confident to sit here and say I loved this book if it was just a work of fiction. It's hard to share my thoughts on this one as it is Jeanette's life, but it was heartbreaking, intriguing, inspiring, and hopeful, I think, at the end. I think that it was also kind of relatable, which I was surprised by. Obviously, I'm not a former child star, and I'm sure everyone else reading it won't be, for the most part, but there were a lot of things about growing up and, I guess, difficulties with parents and body image that I think are pretty universal themes, so I did really enjoy that. I hope that it was cathartic for her to write. I'm happy that she was able to tell her story in a honest and at times funny way. I think that the tone of the book was just amazing and I would heavily recommend it to everyone. Now moving on to the final book here in my recent reads. This is the most recent one that I have read, and it is The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. So another revisit to Lucy Foley. This is about our main character who goes to stay or visit her brother's apartment in Paris. When she arrives at the apartment, he is nowhere to be found, and everyone in the apartment building or block is quite strange and suspicious. So she's trying to figure out where her brother is and what happened to him. I enjoyed this one quite a bit, more than The Hunting Party, but I'd say not as much as The Guest List. It was still very good though. I loved the setting and it hooked me right away. It had a lot of intriguing twists, which I really liked. I can't say so much in the way of negatives other than the fact I'm just comparing it with other Lucy Foley reads, but yeah, 3.5, enjoyable. I would recommend. I don't think I'd necessarily read this specific one again, but I'm keen to check out other Lucy Foley books in the future. Now the final thing I'll mention, it's not so much as part of the review, just a thought that I had when reading. And it's not a spoiler at all, so don't worry if you haven't read it. But for some reason, I kept expecting this to take a supernatural turn. If you've read it, maybe you'll understand why. Even if you haven't read it, I'm not sure if it matters, but I just feel the need to say, for some reason, I kept expecting there to be a reveal that the people that lived in the apartment were vampires. Yeah, I was reading it late at night, so I don't know if that's part of it. My tired brain. Anyway, ending in a very random place there. Those are all of my thoughts about the recent reads that I have gone through for the past couple months. Before I go, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this one. Please give me a thumbs up if you did and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, let me know in the comments down below if you had any similar thoughts or what are your takes on the books that I've read. If you disagree with me, that's cool. Let me know what you think and let me know any book recommendations if you have them. But like I said, I will be leaving you here and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye!